Right now, somewhere in your body, there's a protein that 85% of humanity carries on the surface of their red blood cells. It's called the Rh factor, and if you have it, you're Rh positive. Simple, normal, unremarkable. But here's where things get weird. If you're part of the other 15%, if you're Rh negative, you don't have this protein at all. And nobody, not geneticists, not evolutionary biologists, not hematologists, nobody can fully explain why. See, in biology, when something disappears from a population, there's usually a reason. A mutation that stops producing a protein typically means that protein wasn't essential for survival, or maybe lacking it provided some advantage. That's how evolution works. But the Rh factor, it's ancient. It's in rhesus monkeys, which is where it got its name. It's in apes. It's in nearly every primate species on Earth, which means our ancestors had it for millions of years before some humans mysteriously lost it. And here's the part that keeps researchers up at night. When an Rh negative mother gets pregnant with an Rh positive baby, her body treats the fetus like a foreign invader. Her immune system literally attacks her own child. Without modern medical intervention, the baby often dies. The mother's body becomes hostile to her own offspring. Now, think about that from an evolutionary perspective. A trait that makes mothers reject their babies should have been eliminated from the gene pool millions of years ago. But it wasn't. Instead, 15% of us carry it. In some populations, like the Basque people of Spain and France, that number jumps to 35%. Something doesn't add up. You know that feeling when you stumble into information that feels like it shouldn't be public? Like you've opened a door you weren't supposed to find? That's what diving into Rh negative research feels like. Because the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. This isn't just about blood types. It's about ancient texts describing beings with special blood. It's about royal families obsessively tracking their lineages. It's about modern abduction researchers noticing that an unusually high percentage of people claiming contact with non-human intelligence are Rh negative. If you're settling in with this to fall asleep or just curious about where this is going, do me a favour and drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I check these and it's fascinating. Tokyo at sunrise, New York at midnight, London during lunch. All of us scattered across the planet, maybe some of us carrying this mysterious blood, trying to figure out what it means. The official scientific explanation is straightforward. Rh negative blood is just a genetic mutation, probably emerged around 35,000 years ago, spread through certain populations, nothing mysterious about it. But that explanation has holes you could drive a truck through. For one thing, if it's just a random mutation, why does it cluster so heavily in specific populations? Why are the Basque people, who speak a language unrelated to any other on Earth and have genetic markers suggesting they're one of Europe's oldest indigenous groups, so overwhelmingly Rh negative? Why do European royal families, who've been obsessively inbreeding for centuries to keep their bloodlines pure, have such high rates of Rh negative blood? And why, if you start digging through ancient texts, do you keep finding references to special bloodlines? The Nephilim in the Book of Enoch, described as offspring of angels and humans. The blue-blooded aristocracy, a term that supposedly comes from Spanish nobles whose pale skin showed their veins so clearly they appeared to have blue blood. The divine right of kings, which wasn't just political propaganda, but was tied to the belief that royal blood was literally different from commoner blood. Here's what we're going to explore together. We'll start with the hard science. What actually makes Rh negative blood different at a cellular level? Because understanding the biology is crucial to understanding why this matters. Then we'll dive into the Basque mystery, a people who shouldn't exist according to conventional migration patterns, whose language predates Indo-European expansion, and whose blood tells a story that doesn't fit the standard narrative of human evolution. From there, we'll explore the ancient astronaut theories, the Nephilim connections, the persistent legends of beings from elsewhere breeding with humans and leaving behind a genetic legacy. We'll look at why European royalty became obsessed with bloodline purity and what they might have known that we've forgotten. We'll examine the alleged traits associated with Rh-negative blood, the higher IQs, the lower body temperatures, the unusual healing abilities, the claims of psychic sensitivity. Some of this is documented, some of it is anecdotal, all of it is strange. We'll investigate the alien hypothesis, the theory that Rh-negative blood isn't a mutation at all, but an introduction, something added to the human genome by outside intervention. And we'll dive into the conspiracy theories, the claims that secret societies have been tracking Rh-negative bloodlines for centuries, that governments know more than they're saying, that there's a reason this information stays on the fringes of mainstream science. The question isn't whether Rh-negative blood is different. It obviously is. The question is what that difference means, where it came from, and why, after decades of genetic research, we still don't have satisfying answers. Something about this blood doesn't fit. And maybe, just maybe, that's because it doesn't belong here at all. Let's talk about blood. Not the Hollywood version, not the stuff of vampire legends, but the actual biological substance pumping through your veins right now. Because in 1937, two researchers working with rhesus monkeys stumbled onto something that would fundamentally change our understanding of human biology. And in the process, they uncovered a mystery that science still hasn't fully explained. Karl Landsteiner and Alexander Wiener were studying blood incompatibility. Nothing glamorous, just rigorous laboratory work trying to understand why some blood transfusions worked, while others killed the patient. They were injecting rhesus monkey blood into rabbits, studying the immune responses, doing the kind of meticulous experimental work that rarely makes headlines. Then they tested human blood against the antibodies they'd created. What they found shouldn't have been possible. Most people, about 85% of the human population, had blood that reacted to the rhesus antibodies. Their blood cells carried something, a protein marker that matched what was found in the monkeys. They called it the rhesus factor, or Rh positive. Simple enough. But the other 15%, their blood showed nothing, no reaction, no protein marker. It was as if they were missing something that should be there. Something that every known primate species had. They called this absence Rh negative. Now, before we dive into the deep end, let's get the basic biology straight, because this matters. The difference between Rh positive and Rh negative blood isn't some mystical force or genetic anomaly from another dimension. It's a protein. Specifically, it's called the D antigen, one of about 50 proteins that can exist on the surface of red blood cells. Rh positive individuals have this protein. Rh negative individuals don't. That's it. That's the entire biological difference. Except it's not that simple. Because that one missing protein creates consequences that nature really shouldn't allow. Here's where it gets disturbing. When an Rh negative woman gets pregnant with an Rh positive baby, her body treats the fetus like an invading organism. During pregnancy, especially during birth, some of the baby's blood cells can cross into the mother's bloodstream. Her immune system, encountering this foreign protein it has never seen before, does what immune systems do. It attacks. It creates antibodies specifically designed to destroy anything carrying that Rh positive marker. The first pregnancy usually ends fine. The baby is born before the mother's immune system can mount a full response. But those antibodies stay in her system, waiting. If she gets pregnant again with another Rh positive baby, her body's ready this time. The antibodies cross the placenta and start destroying the baby's red blood cells while it's still in the womb. This condition is called hemolytic disease of the newborn. And before modern medicine figured out how to prevent it, with Rh immune globulin injections, it killed or severely damaged countless infants. Let that sink in for a moment. A mother's body, designed by evolution to nurture and protect offspring, instead attacks and potentially kills her own baby. This is the opposite of what natural selection should produce. Every other biological system is optimized for reproductive success. That's the whole point of evolution. Pass on your genes, protect your offspring, ensure the next generation survives. But Rh-negative blood actively works against reproduction when paired with Rh-positive partners. From a pure evolutionary standpoint, Rh-negative blood should have been eliminated from the human gene pool thousands of years ago. Any trait that reduces reproductive success gets weeded out fast. That's how natural selection works. But not only has Rh-negative blood survived, it's thrived in certain populations, reaching concentrations as high as 35% in some regions. So either evolution made a mistake, which it rarely does, or something else is going on. Let's look at the comparative biology, because this is where things get really strange. Landsteiner and Wiener discovered the Rh factor by studying rhesus monkeys. Those monkeys were Rh positive, just like 85% of humans. Then researchers started testing other primates. Chimpanzees, Rh positive. Gorillas, Rh positive. Orangutans, gibbons, baboons, every primate species they could get blood samples from, all Rh positive, every single one, except humans. We're the only primate species that shows this variation. The only ones with a significant population lacking something that appears to be universal among our closest evolutionary relatives. Now, you might be thinking this is just a mutation, a genetic variant that appeared randomly and stuck around through genetic drift. And maybe you're right. Genetic mutations happen all the time. Most of them are neutral, neither helpful nor harmful, and they persist in populations just by chance. But here's the problem with that explanation. Rh-negative blood isn't neutral, it's actively disadvantageous for reproduction, and it's not randomly distributed. This is where the geographical distribution becomes impossible to ignore. The highest concentration of Rh-negative blood on Earth is found among the Basque people of northern Spain and southern France. About 35% of ethnic Basques are Rh-negative, more than double the European average. From that centre point in the Basque region, Rh-negative frequencies gradually decrease as you move outward. Western Europeans show rates around 15 to 16%. Eastern Europeans drop to 10 to 12%. Move into Asia, and the frequency plummets to 1% or less. In sub-Saharan Africa and among indigenous populations of the Americas and Australia, Rh-negative blood is virtually non-existent, often less than 1%. This isn't a random pattern. This is a distribution map that suggests a point of origin, a place where Rh-negative blood first appeared and then spread outward through migration and mixing. The Basque region isn't just randomly high in Rh-negative frequency, it's the epicenter. And as you move away from that epicenter, through successive waves of migration and population mixing, the frequency dilutes. Population geneticists have run the numbers on this. For Rh-negative blood to reach 35% frequency in a population, given its reproductive disadvantage, one of three things has to be true. Either it appeared very recently, so natural selection hasn't had time to eliminate it yet, or it provides some hidden survival advantage that we haven't identified, something that outweighs the reproductive costs. Or it was deliberately maintained through cultural practices, selective breeding, or population isolation. The recent appearance theory doesn't work. Genetic dating puts the Rh-negative mutation somewhere between 25,000 and 35,000 years ago. That's plenty of time for natural selection to reduce it to trace levels if it was truly disadvantageous. The hidden advantage theory is possible, but decades of research haven't identified any clear benefit. Rh-negative individuals don't show better disease resistance, longer lifespans, or any other obvious survival edge. Which leaves us with the third option, and this is where mainstream science starts getting uncomfortable. Because if Rh-negative blood reached high frequencies through non-random processes, through selective breeding or cultural preservation, then somebody was doing the selecting. Somebody decided this blood type was worth preserving, worth maintaining, even at the cost of reproductive complications. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into the historical and cultural mysteries, we need to look at one more piece of biological evidence that makes the whole picture even stranger. Remember how every other primate species is Rh positive? Well, researchers have traced the genetic history of the Rh factor back through evolutionary time. The protein complex that creates the Rh positive marker appears to have originated in primitive mammals more than 160 million years ago. It's been conserved, meaning it's remained essentially unchanged through the entire evolution of primates. From tiny lemurs to great apes, every branch of the primate family tree has maintained this protein. Conservation across that much evolutionary time suggests the protein is important, maybe even critical, for something. Evolution doesn't preserve useless traits for 160 million years. The fact that it's universal among primates suggests it provides some fundamental advantage, yet humans lost it, or more accurately, some humans lost it, and not only survived, but thrived. This is the biological paradox at the heart of the Rh-negative mystery. A trait that appears beneficial and universal among all primates suddenly becomes optional in one species. A trait that creates reproductive complications somehow reaches high frequency in isolated populations. A trait that should have been eliminated by natural selection instead becomes one of the defining characteristics of specific ethnic groups. Modern medicine has largely solved the practical problems of Rh incompatibility. Rh-negative mothers get immune globulin injections that prevent their bodies from producing antibodies against their Rh-positive babies. The crisis that once killed thousands of infants every year has been reduced to a manageable medical condition, but solving the practical problem hasn't solved the theoretical mystery. Why does Rh-negative blood exist at all? Where did it come from? And why, despite all the evolutionary pressures working against it, has it persisted and even flourished in certain human populations? The standard scientific answer is mutation and genetic drift. A random change in the DNA that eliminated the Rh factor protein, followed by population bottlenecks and founder effects that allowed the trait to reach high frequencies in isolated groups. It's a neat, tidy explanation that fits within conventional evolutionary theory, and it might even be true. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why the Basque people, who also have unique linguistic and genetic characteristics setting them apart from surrounding populations, show such extraordinarily high Rh-negative frequencies. It doesn't explain the cultural traditions that seem to have developed around blood purity in certain royal lineages. It doesn't explain the persistent historical references to special bloodlines, chosen people, or the offspring of gods. We're left with a biological fact that opens onto a series of historical, cultural, and anthropological mysteries. Rh-negative blood is real, it's measurable, it's different, and its distribution across human populations tells a story that we're only beginning to understand. A story that starts with genetics, but leads into ancient history, isolated populations, and questions about human origins that mainstream science isn't quite ready to ask. There's a place in Europe where the rules don't apply, a region tucked between France and Spain where the people speak a language that shouldn't exist, carry genes that don't match anyone around them, and possess the highest concentration of Rh-negative blood on planet Earth. Up to 35% of the Basque population carries this genetic marker. For context, that's more than double the rate found anywhere else in Europe, and nearly 7 times the global average. This isn't just a statistical anomaly. This is a genetic signature so distinct, so concentrated, that it demands an explanation. The Basques call themselves Euskaldunak, speakers of Euskara. And that language? It's unlike anything else on Earth. Linguists have been trying to connect Euskara to other language families for over 200 years. They've failed. Every time someone claims they found a connection to Caucasian languages, or ancient Iberian, or even Proto-Indo-European, other researchers tear the hypothesis apart. The evidence just isn't there. Euskara stands alone, a linguistic island surrounded by a sea of Indo-European languages that swept across Europe thousands of years ago, erasing almost everything that came before. Except here. In these mountains, the old language survived. But it's not just the language. The genetic evidence is even more bewildering. When scientists started analysing Basque DNA in the 1990s, they expected to find typical Western European markers. Instead, they found a population that was genetically distinct from everyone around them. The Basques don't cluster with Spaniards. They don't cluster with French. They don't even cluster with other Iberian populations who live just a few hundred miles away. Their genetic signature suggests they've been isolated for an extraordinary length of time. We're talking thousands of years of genetic continuity while empires rose and fell around them, while waves of migration swept through Europe, while everyone else was mixing and blending. The Basques remained apart, distinct, different. Now, isolation alone wouldn't necessarily preserve Rh-negative blood at such high frequencies. Genetic drift could have increased it randomly in a small population. But here's the thing. The Basques weren't that small, and they weren't completely isolated. They traded with surrounding populations, sometimes fought with them, occasionally married into them. Yet somehow, that 35% Rh-negative frequency remained stable for millennia. This suggests active selection, either cultural practices that favoured Rh-negative bloodlines, or some unknown environmental or biological factor that gave Rh-negative individuals an advantage in this specific region. The marriage customs provide a clue. For as far back as records go, Basque communities practiced what anthropologists call endogamy, strict preference for marrying within the group, not just within the Basque people as a whole, but within specific valleys, specific villages. A person from one valley might travel 30 miles to the next valley and be considered a foreigner, an outsider. Marriage alliances were carefully negotiated between families who had known each other for generations. This wasn't unusual in pre-modern societies, but the Basques took it to an extreme. They maintained these practices long after other European populations had become more mobile and cosmopolitan. Even into the 20th century, many Basque communities showed strong preferences for local marriages. This created what geneticists call a founder effect on steroids. If the original Basque population had a high frequency of Rh-negative blood, and they maintained strict endogamy for thousands of years, that frequency would be preserved and even amplified. But this raises another question. Where did that original high frequency come from? Who were the founders? The theories range from scientific to speculative to completely wild. The mainstream archaeological view is that the Basques are descendants of the original hunter-gatherer populations who lived in Western Europe before the arrival of farming peoples around 7,000 years ago. When Indo-European speakers swept across Europe during the Bronze Age, they mixed with and largely replaced these older populations, except in the Basque country. The mountains provided refuge. The locals resisted cultural and genetic assimilation. They preserved their ancient language and their ancient genes while the rest of Europe was being transformed. This explanation fits the linguistic evidence. Euskara could be a survivor from that pre-Indo-European linguistic landscape, the last echo of languages that once covered the continent. It fits the genetic evidence too. Studies show the Basques have higher frequencies of genetic markers associated with Western European hunter-gatherers than any other modern population. But it doesn't fully explain the Rh negative mystery. If the Basques are simply preserved hunter-gatherers, why don't other isolated European populations show similar Rh negative frequencies? The Sardinians were isolated, the Icelanders were isolated. Neither shows anything close to Basque levels. This is where things get interesting. Some researchers have suggested the Basques might be survivors of a much older European population, one that predates even the hunter-gatherers we know from the archaeological record. There are tantalizing hints of human presence in Europe going back hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthals were here, Denisovans might have been here, and there were likely other human populations we haven't identified yet, groups that left minimal archaeological traces but might have contributed genes to later populations. What if the Basques carry genetic heritage from one of these mystery populations? What if that's where the Rh negative concentration comes from? A bloodline so ancient it predates the normal categories we use to understand human ancestry. This would explain why the Basque genetic signature is so distinct, why their language connects to nothing else, why they seem to be something older than the populations around them. Then there are the caves. The Basque region is home to some of Europe's most spectacular Paleolithic cave art. Altamira, just outside the traditional Basque territory, contains paintings that are 36,000 years old. Caves deeper in Basque country show evidence of continuous human occupation going back even further. And the art itself is extraordinary. Not just simple hunting scenes, but complex compositions showing animals, human figures and geometric patterns that some researchers think might represent astronomical observations. Cave paintings in Lascaux and other sites show arrangements of dots and marks that correlate with lunar cycles and stellar positions. The people who created this art were tracking the heavens, recording their observations over generations. Were they the ancestors of the Basques? Did they pass down astronomical knowledge along with their language and their blood? The Basque calendar and traditional cosmology show unusual sophistication, with detailed systems for tracking solar and lunar cycles that seem to predate known Mediterranean influences. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting the cave paintings represent a kind of proto-writing system, a way of encoding complex information that predates Sumerian cuneiform by 30,000 years. If true, this would make the Basques the inheritors of Europe's oldest literary tradition. But the evidence remains controversial. The symbols could be astronomical records, or ritual markings, or something we don't yet understand. And then there are the really wild theories. Atlantis inevitably comes up. The Basque region is near the Atlantic coast. Their maritime traditions go back millennia. Some speculative researchers have suggested the Basques are survivors of a lost Atlantic civilization, possibly Plato's Atlantis itself. According to this theory, when their homeland sank or was destroyed, survivors fled to the mountains of northern Spain and southern France, bringing their language, their genetic legacy, and possibly advanced knowledge that was gradually lost over generations. There's no archaeological evidence for this, none, but the theory persists because it offers a neat explanation for all the mysteries at once. The unique language, brought from Atlantis, the distinct genetics, an isolated Atlantic population, the Rh negative blood, a marker of the Atlantean bloodline. It's compelling storytelling, even if it's not compelling science. What we can say with certainty is this: the Basques are extraordinary. They represent a genetic and cultural continuity that spans thousands of years, preserved through a combination of geography, culture, and possibly selection pressures we don't fully understand. They carry the highest concentration of Rh negative blood anywhere on Earth. They speak a language that connects to nothing else in the human family, and they've maintained their distinct identity through Roman conquest, Visigothic invasion, Moorish expansion, and Spanish centralization. They are survivors of something old, something that predates the Europe we think we know. Whether they're simply the last descendants of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, or whether they represent something stranger, something older, something that challenges our understanding of human history, the Basque mystery endures. And at the center of that mystery is blood, the blood that 35% of them carry, the blood that sets them apart, the blood that might hold secrets we're only beginning to understand. Let's talk about the oldest conspiracy theory in human history. Not the kind you find on internet forums, the kind that's written in text thousands of years old, repeated across dozens of cultures that supposedly never contacted each other, and consistently describes the same impossible event: giants walking the earth, gods breeding with humans, and bloodlines that weren't quite human anymore. Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4. Most people skip right past this section on their way to the flood story. But these 4 verses contain one of the most disturbing passages in the entire Bible. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. 4 verses. That's it. The Bible drops this absolutely explosive claim, beings called sons of God breeding with human women and producing hybrid offspring called Nephilim, and then just moves on. No explanation, no details. Just a casual mention that non-human entities were creating hybrid bloodlines and producing heroes of old, men of renown. Then the flood comes and supposedly washes it all away. Except the text says the Nephilim were there, and also afterward. After the flood. Which means either some of them survived or the breeding program started up again. And if you're wondering whether you're reading that correctly, whether the text really is describing what it seems to be describing, ancient Jewish and Christian scholars wondered the same thing, and most of them concluded, yes, this is exactly what it's describing. Interbreeding between human and non-human entities, creating hybrid bloodlines that persisted through human populations. Now, the mainstream interpretation tries to soften this. Some scholars argue the sons of God were just the descendants of Seth, the righteous line, breeding with the descendants of Cain, the corrupted line. But this interpretation has problems. Why would the text use such bizarre language to describe human intermarriage? Why would regular humans produce giants? And why would this particular event trigger the flood, the complete destruction of the world, if it was just people marrying other people? The early church fathers didn't buy the sanitized version. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, they all understood the text literally. Non-human entities, whether you call them angels, gods, or something else, came to earth and bred with humans. The offspring were the Nephilim, giants who became the mighty men and men of renown mentioned in ancient texts, and their bloodlines persisted. But Genesis gives us almost nothing to work with. Just 4 verses and the aftermath. If you want the full story, you have to go to a text that didn't make it into the Bible, the Book of Enoch. Enoch is fascinating because it was considered scripture by early Christians. It's quoted in the New Testament book of Jude. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church still includes it in their Bible, but for most Christian denominations it was removed, declared apocryphal, too strange to be canonical. And when you read what it says, you start understanding why church authorities might have wanted it buried. The Book of Enoch names names. It identifies 200 angels called Watchers who descended to Mount Hermon, took an oath together, and decided to take human wives. Their leader was Semjaza, but the most infamous was Azazel. These weren't just random encounters. This was organized, planned. Two